40% of U.S. e-commerce. One company, larger than the next 10 competitors combined. Amazon is not just a marketplace. It is a corporate empire disguised as convenience. Last year alone, its revenue eclipsed the GDP of more than 150 nations. A single corporation, out-earning countries, outpacing governments, outlasting competitors. And at its center, Jeff Bezos, the man who transformed an online bookstore into a trillion-dollar valuation, a machine that reshaped how the world shops, works, and even thinks. But behind the glossy promise of free shipping and next-day delivery lies a darker reality. In the warehouses, workers collapse under algorithms. On Wall Street, investors whisper of monopoly power. In the corridors of politics, lobbyists shape laws to shield the empire. And in homes around the globe, devices quietly record the rhythms of daily life, converting privacy into profit. Jeff Bezos does not just sell books or gadgets or groceries. He sells control. And with that control comes power. Power vast enough to rival governments, subtle enough to remain unseen. The question is not how Bezos built Amazon. The question is what price we've all paid for its rise. And this story is only beginning. This isn't entertainment. This is the autopsy of empire. Empires are not always forged by kings or generals. In our age, they rise from code, warehouses, and balance sheets. They do not conquer land with armies, but with algorithms and logistics networks. And yet, like every empire before them, they thrive on the same ingredients: wealth, ambition, and control. Amazon is more than a company. It is an infrastructure of modern life, a machine that delivers packages, processes payments, and powers the internet itself. On Wall Street, analysts hail its trillion-dollar valuation. In boardrooms, investors treat it as untouchable. From skyscrapers in Seattle to data centers in Virginia, its reach appears limitless. But every skyscraper casts a shadow. At the Dark Files, we examine those shadows. We trace money trails through hedge funds and offshore accounts. We expose billion-dollar valuations that hide cracks beneath glossy surfaces. We dissect the myths surrounding billionaires, myths of genius, inevitability, and progress, and uncover the exploitation, greed, and manipulation buried underneath. Enron promised innovation and collapsed into fraud. Lehman Brothers fueled growth before triggering the market crash of 2008. FTX claimed to revolutionize finance and dissolved into chaos. Each was celebrated as untouchable until the collapse revealed the truth. Tonight, our focus is Amazon. To millions, it is convenience, the smiling arrow delivering everything from food to entertainment. But beneath that smile lies surveillance, crushed competition, and political power wielded without accountability. This is not just a story of retail. It is the story of how one man built a shadow empire, and how the foundations of that empire may already be fracturing. Because behind every delivery, every data center, every billion-dollar valuation, one truth remains: power always has a cost, and Amazon's bill is coming due. Jeff Bezos is not merely a businessman. He is the architect of one of the most expansive corporate empires in modern history. His journey from a restless child dismantling toys to the richest man alive is often painted as a tale of vision and innovation. But in reality, it is also a story about ambition without limits, about a man who learned to weaponize efficiency, data, and dominance until his company reshaped the very infrastructure of commerce. Born in 1964, Bezos grew up with an engineer's precision and a dreamer's restlessness. At Princeton, he studied computer science and electrical engineering, sharpening a mind that was already obsessed with scale. Wall Street soon claimed him, where he worked for hedge funds and investment firms. There, he absorbed the mechanics of money, the way capital moves, the way investors chase growth, the way markets reward disruption. For Bezos, this was not just education. It was training for empire. In 1994, he left Wall Street and moved west. From a garage in Seattle, with a desk made of wooden doors and a handful of employees, he launched an online bookstore. It was modest, but it was also a test. If people could be persuaded to buy books online, what else might they buy? The company was named Amazon, after the largest river on Earth. The metaphor was deliberate. This was not a business designed to remain small. It was a flood, a torrent, an unstoppable current that would carve new channels into the global economy. The timing could not have been more perfect. The internet was just beginning to reshape culture. Consumers were curious, hesitant, but ready. Amazon offered them a leap of faith. Books turned into CDs, CDs into electronics, electronics into household goods. Each new category was a reminder that Bezos was not running a bookstore. He was building the infrastructure for a new kind of marketplace. But Bezos understood something deeper than his competitors. The true prize was not retail. It was logistics. While the public saw a website with a smiling logo, Bezos was constructing a labyrinth of warehouses, trucks, planes, and robots. Every package shipped was proof of something larger, a supply chain so vast it rivaled governments. Wall Street watched with awe as Amazon scaled. Billion-dollar valuations turned into trillion-dollar headlines. Investors cheered, hedge funds poured in money, and stock tickers flickered with Amazon's relentless climb. By the early 2000s, Amazon was no longer just a store. It was becoming an ecosystem. Its promise of one-click convenience became a reflex, a habit baked into daily life. Amazon Prime transformed customers into subscribers, locking millions into the empire with the lure of free shipping. On the surface, it looked harmless. But beneath the gloss of cardboard boxes, Bezos was building something far more dangerous: dependency. Then came Amazon Web Services, AWS. Born out of Amazon's own need for computing power, it quietly evolved into the backbone of the modern internet. Today, AWS hosts companies, governments, and entire industries. Netflix, the CIA, Fortune 500 giants, all rely on servers run by Amazon. The empire was no longer just physical, it was digital, invisible, omnipresent. And with that came data. Every click, every purchase, every search was stored, analyzed, and fed into algorithms. Amazon learned not just what customers bought, but what they desired, when they desired it, and how much they were willing to pay. Data became the empire's most valuable resource, turning consumer behavior into a commodity traded in silence. For Bezos, this was empire building in its purest form. The smiling arrow in Amazon's logo, from A to Z, was not a promise of variety. It was a declaration of conquest. Why does this matter? Because Amazon is not just a retailer, it is a machine that reaches into homes, workplaces, and governments. It dictates how small businesses compete, how products are priced, how labor is organized, and how information flows. It is an empire of logistics and data, backed by Wall Street capital and fueled by investor hunger. And like every empire before, Amazon carries its own fragility. Beneath the trillion-dollar valuation lies a foundation built on exploitation and control. Workers racing against algorithms, small businesses suffocating under predatory tactics, governments entangled in Amazon's infrastructure, customers surrendering privacy for convenience. For years, the myth of progress has masked these shadows. But history has always shown us the same truth. Every empire that grows unchecked eventually faces its reckoning. Jeff Bezos did not just build a company. He built a shadow empire. And the deeper we look, the more the cracks begin to show. Because Amazon's story is not just about rise, it is about the costs buried beneath cardboard boxes and cloud servers. Costs that can no longer be ignored. The rise is coming. But so is the fall. Every empire begins with a spark. For Amazon, that spark was not just the internet. It was timing, capital, and a founder whose obsession with scale bordered on fanaticism. Jeff Bezos left Wall Street not because he was tired of finance, but because he saw something bigger. In the early 1990s, While most investors were still squinting at dial-up modems and wondering whether the internet would survive, Bezos was calculating exponential growth rates. He understood a truth that few in corporate America grasped. The internet was not just communication, it was infrastructure. And infrastructure meant empire. Amazon launched in 1994 as an online bookstore. At first glance, it was unremarkable. The company sold books at a discount, promising selection and convenience that brick-and-mortar stores could not match. But the vision was never about books. Books were merely the wedge, a test case to prove that people would trust a digital platform with their money. Wall Street doubted it, but Bezos pushed ahead. He borrowed millions, leaned on investors hungry for dot-com dreams, and began the slow process of turning skepticism into inevitability. By 1997, Amazon went public. Its IPO on Wall Street was not just a financial milestone, it was a declaration of ambition. Bezos raised $54 million, a modest sum compared to future valuations, but enough to fuel expansion. The market was euphoric. Analysts talked of a digital frontier. Hedge funds began circling, and Amazon's stock ticker became a symbol of the internet's promise. The company's valuation leapt into the billions, despite the fact that it had never turned a profit. But profits were irrelevant. The myth of growth was enough to sustain the rise. As the dot-com bubble swelled, Amazon became a darling of speculation. Packages multiplied, warehouses expanded, and Bezos's vision spread like wildfire. By the early 2000s, while many dot-com peers collapsed into bankruptcy, Amazon survived. It had outlasted the first market crash, not through luck, but through ruthless discipline. Bezos cut costs, slashed margins, and demanded efficiency at every level. Employees described him as relentless, a leader who measured success not in comfort, but in survival. Survival soon gave way to dominance. By the mid-2000s, Amazon was no longer a niche experiment. It was a force. Product categories exploded. Books became music. Music became electronics. Electronics became everything. One-click shopping, patented in 1999, turned friction into addiction. Prime membership, launched in 2005, locked millions of customers into the empire. Free shipping was never free. It was bait, a psychological hook that tethered consumers to Amazon's network. Once customers joined Prime, their spending skyrocketed. Bezos had transformed retail into a subscription service, a recurring revenue stream that pleased Wall Street and terrified competitors. But the real genius of Amazon's rise was hidden in the background. While consumers marveled at cardboard, boxes arriving on their doorsteps, Bezos was building logistics infrastructure that rivaled national governments. Warehouses multiplied across states and continents. Delivery routes were optimized by algorithms. Robots entered the workforce, streamlining operations and cutting costs. By the 2010s, Amazon was flying its own planes, operating its own trucks, and moving toward independence from traditional shippers. Every package was proof of control. The empire did not just sell products, it owned the arteries of commerce. Then came the most pivotal move: Amazon Web Services. Originally created to solve Amazon's internal computing needs, AWS quietly launched in 2006. Few understood its potential at first, but over time it became the hidden engine of Amazon's rise. AWS allowed companies to rent computing power instead of buying it. Startups, corporations, and even governments began migrating to Amazon's servers. By the 2010s, AWS was generating billions in profit, far surpassing retail margins. Netflix ran on AWS. The CIA ran on AWS. Hedge funds crunched algorithms on AWS. What the world saw as an online store was, in truth, a dual empire: logistics and cloud computing, physical and digital. This dual structure fueled Wall Street's infatuation. Investors spoke of Amazon not just as a retailer, but as the future of infrastructure. Its trillion-dollar valuation was justified, they argued, because Amazon owned not only today, but tomorrow. Hedge funds poured capital into its stock. Analysts compared it to railroads, to oil barons, to monopolies of the past. Each comparison carried the same undertone. Amazon was becoming too large to challenge, and Bezos thrived on that perception. He cultivated the image of a visionary. Interviews showed him laughing with a trademark cackle, boasting about long-term thinking, dismissing quarterly profits as irrelevant compared to decades of growth. He framed Amazon as a mission, not just a business, a mission to serve customers, to innovate, to think at day-one mentality forever. Wall Street applauded. Governments hesitated to regulate. Competitors folded. Meanwhile, Bezos himself embraced the spoils of empire. His wealth soared into the tens of billions, then hundreds. He purchased mansions, estates, and eventually a $500 million yacht. He traveled in private jets, dined with world leaders, and positioned himself as both a businessman and a statesman. Skyscrapers in Seattle bore Amazon's name. His empire stretched not only across commerce but across culture. Amazon's rise was not without warning signs. Workers whispered of brutal conditions in warehouses, of injuries, surveillance, and burnout. Small businesses complained of predatory practices, of being forced to compete on a platform tilted in Amazon's favor. Regulators murmured about antitrust violations, but the momentum was unstoppable. Each criticism was drowned out by rising revenue, by soaring stock prices, by the sheer spectacle of growth. By the late 2010s, Amazon controlled nearly 40% of US e-commerce. Its marketplace hosted millions of sellers, many of whom depended entirely on its platform. Prime membership surpassed 100 million. AWS accounted for the majority of global cloud infrastructure. The empire's valuation exceeded $1 trillion. On Wall Street, Amazon was not just a stock, it was a pillar of portfolios, a hedge. Against the future, a bet no one dared to oppose. The rise was dazzling, unprecedented in speed and scale. From a garage in Seattle to a global empire in less than 3 decades, Amazon had rewritten the rules of business. Jeff Bezos, once a curious child tinkering with toys, now stood as the richest man in the world, commanding a corporate empire larger than nations. But history has a cruel rhythm. Every empire shines brightest just before the fall. Enron was once hailed as the most innovative energy company on Earth, until its accounting tricks unraveled. Lehman Brothers was the cornerstone of Wall Street, until subprime mortgages exposed its fragility. FTX promised to revolutionize finance, until billions vanished overnight. Each collapse carried the same lesson. Unchecked growth breeds hidden cracks. Amazon's rise was extraordinary. But beneath the skyscrapers, the warehouses, the data centers, and the billion-dollar valuations, the cracks were already there. Cracks in labor practices, cracks in competition, cracks in trust, and those cracks were about to spread. Every empire reaches a moment when the shine begins to dull, when the story of inevitability collides with the weight of reality. For Amazon, the turning point came not in a single scandal or headline, but in a slow accumulation of fractures, financial, political, cultural, and human, that exposed the fragility behind the trillion-dollar valuation. By the late 2010s, Amazon appeared untouchable. Its stock ticker climbed relentlessly, hedge funds poured capital into its shares, and investors treated it as a safe harbor. Wall Street crowned Bezos as a genius, a master strategist who could bend markets to his will. But behind the skyscrapers of Seattle and the glowing valuation reports, shadows lengthened. The first cracks came from the warehouses. Stories began to leak out, workers collapsing from heat, ambulances parked outside fulfillment centers during peak shopping seasons, algorithms tracking every movement. Employees described racing against machines, their pace dictated not by human limits, but by code. Bathroom breaks became liabilities. Injury rates soared above industry averages. Amazon's logistics miracle, the very backbone of its empire, was revealed as a human cost hidden behind cardboard smiles. Criticism mounted. Journalists published exposés. Regulators started to ask questions. But Amazon denied, deflected, and pressed forward. Growth, not reform, remained the priority. And yet the world was beginning to see through the cracks in the empire's facade. The second fracture came from competition. Small businesses and sellers trapped in Amazon's marketplace. The buy box, the tiny feature that determined which seller's product appeared by default, became the subject of investigation. Sellers alleged that Amazon tilted the algorithm in favor of its own private label products, burying competitors and suffocating independent merchants. Congressional investigators later uncovered documents showing Amazon had used data from third-party sellers to copy products and undercut rivals. What was presented as a free and open marketplace was, in truth, a rigged game. Amazon was both referee and player, judge and competitor. The third crack emerged in politics. By 2018, Amazon had become one of the largest spenders on lobbying in Washington. Its influence stretched from Brussels to state legislatures. The company pushed for favorable tax policies, blocked antitrust momentum, and quietly reshaped labor laws. To critics, Amazon was no longer just a retailer. It was a political actor, one with resources rivaling nations. Bezos himself amplified his power by purchasing the Washington Post, giving him both a voice in media and an image of civic responsibility. But the purchase also raised questions. Was Bezos a businessman, or was he becoming something closer to an unelected statesman? Meanwhile, AWS was cementing Amazon's role as silent infrastructure. It hosted Pentagon data, CIA operations, financial systems, and entire industries. Governments and corporations alike were entrusting their most sensitive information to a single private company. The question of monopoly was no longer just about commerce, it was about sovereignty. If one corporation controlled the arteries of digital life, how much power did elected governments truly have? And then, the public began to notice the surveillance. Alexa devices sat in kitchens, recording commands, learning habits, mapping the rhythms of family life. Ring cameras captured doorsteps, often shared with police departments without user consent. Consumers who once saw Amazon as convenience began to suspect it was also control. Every search, every order, every conversation became a data point, feeding the empire's algorithms, shaping prices, manipulating demand. The convenience of tomorrow was being purchased with the privacy of today. The turning point came into sharp relief in 2018 when New York City courted Amazon for its second headquarters, HQ2. The deal promised tens of thousands of jobs in exchange for billions in tax incentives. Politicians hailed it as progress, but the public backlash was swift. Residents protested, arguing that Amazon's presence would inflate rents, crush local businesses, and siphon public money to subsidize one of the richest corporations in history. Under pressure, Amazon abruptly canceled the plan. For the first time, public resistance had forced the empire to retreat, Wall Street noticed. Investors whispered about rising risks. Could Amazon's unchecked dominance trigger an antitrust reckoning? Could public backlash dent its growth? Hedge funds, once eager to treat Amazon as an eternal growth story, began quietly hedging their bets. The myth of invincibility was faltering, and Bezos himself was changing. Once the symbol of Amazon's relentless drive, he increasingly turned his gaze toward Blue Origin, his space company. In 2021, he announced he was stepping down as CEO, handing the reins to Andy Jassy, the architect of AWS. To the public, it looked like succession. To insiders, it looked like insulation, a way for Bezos to distance himself from the storm while maintaining control as executive chairman and largest shareholder. The symbolism was stark. The empire was entering a new phase, still vast, still profitable, but under siege from regulators, workers, competitors, and critics. The richest man in the world had begun to retreat from the front lines of his own empire. But empires do not falter from one battle alone. They unravel when cracks multiply faster than they can be concealed. Amazon's turning point was the moment when the world began to ask questions it had once been too dazzled to pose. If the company's warehouses resembled factories of exploitation, if its marketplace suffocated competition, if its cloud division concentrated sovereignty, and if its devices eroded privacy. What exactly was the cost of convenience? The answers would not just reveal flaws in Amazon's empire. They would expose how fragile the foundations of billion-dollar valuations really are, and soon the cracks would spread into collapse. Collapse is rarely sudden. It creeps in from the edges, spreading slowly until the cracks can no longer be ignored. For Amazon, the collapse was not measured in immediate bankruptcy or the shuttering of doors. It was measured in trust lost, in scrutiny intensified, in reputations tarnished, and in the revelation of how brittle a trillion-dollar valuation could be when exposed to daylight. At the heart of Amazon's unraveling was labor. The company's vast logistics machine, once celebrated as a marvel of efficiency, began to reveal its human cost in stark, undeniable terms. Investigations uncovered warehouses where workers walked more than 15 miles a day, tracked by handheld scanners that punished pauses. Heat exhaustion was so common that ambulances often idled outside facilities during peak shopping seasons, waiting for the inevitable collapse of human bodies pushed beyond their limits. One report revealed workers urinating in bottles to avoid losing time. Another exposed injury rates surpassing industry averages by significant margins. These revelations were not isolated anecdotes. They were systemic, documented in court filings, labor reports, and investigative journalism. The very infrastructure that allowed Bezos to boast of customer obsession was built on practices that reduced workers to replaceable parts in a machine. And when those workers organized, Amazon responded not with reform, but with surveillance. Employees who attempted to unionize described intimidation campaigns, firings, and even the hiring of private intelligence firms to monitor dissent. The Empire's smiling arrow logo concealed an iron fist. Wall Street began to take notice. Investors asked whether labor unrest could trigger a market correction. Could a logistics network fueled by exhaustion and fear remain sustainable? Hedge funds, once seduced by Amazon's relentless growth, whispered about long-term risks. A corporate empire can withstand bad headlines, but not a workforce ready to revolt. The second pillar of collapse lay in competition. For years, Amazon had been accused of tilting its marketplace in its own favor. Sellers complained of vanishing overnight, their products buried beneath Amazon Basics or private label clones. Internal documents, uncovered in congressional hearings, revealed that Amazon collected data from third-party sellers, then used it to develop rival products and price them aggressively. The company's public claim of being a neutral platform was exposed as a facade. Amazon was not just a marketplace, it was a predator. Regulators sharpened their knives. In Europe, antitrust authorities filed suits accusing Amazon of stifling competition. In the United States, lawmakers grilled Bezos and his executives under oath. Reports detailed how the buy box, the small digital real estate that determined the default seller, was manipulated to advantage Amazon's own products. Small businesses, once promised a global stage, were revealed as tenants at the mercy of a landlord who could evict them at will. This revelation shattered one of Amazon's core myths, that it had democratized commerce. In reality, it had centralized power, dictating terms from a glass tower in Seattle while claiming to empower entrepreneurs. The collapse of that narrative was not just a PR crisis, it was an existential threat to Amazon's public legitimacy. The third axis of collapse was privacy. Alexa devices had become household fixtures, their cheerful voices assisting families with music, shopping lists, and news updates. But behind the convenience lay a surveillance apparatus. Reports surfaced of employees listening to recorded conversations, of data being shared with third parties, of security vulnerabilities that allowed hackers access. Ring cameras, another Amazon product, were revealed to have partnerships with police departments, giving law enforcement quiet access to private surveillance networks. Customers who once believed they were buying convenience realized they had invited corporate surveillance into their homes. Trust, once lost, is rarely regained, and in Amazon's case, the erosion of trust was systemic. The company had not simply failed to protect privacy, it had built its business on the extraction of it. Every click, every search, every purchase was logged, analyzed, and monetized. The public began to see the cost of free shipping not in dollars, but in dignity. The collapse extended into politics. Amazon had poured millions into lobbying efforts, reshaping legislation in ways that preserved its dominance. But the more politicians were exposed as beneficiaries of Amazon's generosity, the more the public grew suspicious. The HQ2 debacle in New York, where public backlash forced Amazon to abandon a multi-billion-dollar expansion plan, was a watershed moment. For the first time, communities rejected the promise of Amazon jobs, arguing that the hidden costs, skyrocketing rents, displaced small businesses, subsidized tax breaks, were too high. The empire had underestimated the power of collective resistance. Meanwhile, AWS, Amazon's invisible crown jewel, became both a strength and a liability. Governments and corporations had entrusted their most sensitive data to Amazon's cloud. But that concentration of power invited scrutiny. What if outages, cyber attacks, or internal vulnerabilities compromised the backbone of the internet? What if a single corporation controlled too much of the world's digital infrastructure? Whispers of systemic risk, phrases once reserved for Wall Street collapses like Lehman Brothers, began to creep into the conversation about Amazon. And then there was Bezos himself. For years he had embodied the myth of Amazon, the visionary, the relentless innovator, the richest man alive. But as his wealth soared, so too did public resentment. Images of Bezos vacationing on yachts, building a $500 million vessel that required dismantling a historic bridge just to sail, contrasted with stories of workers fainting in warehouses. His journey into space aboard Blue Origin became a symbol not of progress, but of detachment. A billionaire literally leaving the planet while his employees struggled for basic dignity. The symbolism was devastating. Bezos, once admired as an icon of innovation, became the face of excess, of corporate greed, of empire building at humanity's expense. Polls showed rising distrust of Amazon. Political candidates across the spectrum began to name the company as a threat to competition and labor rights. The narrative had shifted. Amazon was no longer just a retailer or a tech company. It was a problem. The parallels with past collapses became impossible to ignore. Enron had promised limitless innovation in energy, only to be revealed as a house of cards. Lehman Brothers had been a pillar of Wall Street, until risky bets collapsed into the 2008 financial crisis. FTX had promised to democratize finance, only to dissolve into fraud. Amazon's collapse was different, slower, but equally revealing. It showed how billion-dollar valuations could obscure fragility, how corporate empires could grow so vast that their rot became invisible until it was undeniable. By the early 2020s, Amazon faced lawsuits from regulators, protests from workers, boycotts from customers, and growing scrutiny from investors. Its stock, once the darling of Wall Street, wavered under the weight of uncertainty. Hedge funds whispered about risk exposure. Banks debated whether Amazon's model, once hailed as indestructible, was in fact unsustainable. The empire had not fallen outright. Packages still arrived, Prime still renewed, AWS still powered much of the internet. But the illusion of inevitability, the belief that Amazon was untouchable, was collapsing. And with it, the myth of Bezos as the infallible empire builder. The darkest truth was not that Amazon mistreated workers, or manipulated markets, or harvested data. It was that the world allowed it. Governments tolerated monopoly in exchange for growth. Consumers traded privacy for convenience. Investors rewarded exploitation with billion-dollar valuations. The collapse of Amazon's narrative was, in truth, a mirror reflecting our own complicity. This was no longer just a company. It was a cautionary tale. The empire of cardboard boxes and cloud servers had revealed its cracks. And in those cracks, the truth was clear. Amazon's shadow empire was not built to last forever. Because every empire, no matter how vast, eventually confronts the weight of its own foundations. And Amazon's foundations were crumbling. The collapse of an empire is never a single event. It unfolds in courts, in markets, in the lives of ordinary people who feel the shockwaves long after the headlines fade. For Amazon, the aftermath was not bankruptcy, it was erosion. Trust, once lost, began to unravel its hold on governments, investors, and consumers alike. The first battlefield was legal. Regulators in the United States and Europe intensified antitrust investigations, filing suits that accused Amazon of monopolistic practices. Courtrooms became arenas where evidence of marketplace manipulation, data abuse, and predatory pricing was laid bare. Lawyers unearthed documents showing that the empire's algorithms were not neutral, they were weapons. Governments that once embraced Amazon as a source of jobs and innovation now questioned whether they had unleashed something far more dangerous, a private monopoly with global reach. Workers, too, carried the consequences. Years of exhaustion and injury could no longer be dismissed as anecdotes. Unions gained momentum. In Staten Island, workers voted to unionize an Amazon warehouse, a milestone that cracked the company's iron grip on labor organizing. Protests erupted across Europe, in Germany, France, and the UK, where workers demanded fair wages and humane conditions. What had once been scattered voices of dissent became a chorus that Wall Street could no longer ignore. Labor unrest was no longer a PR problem, it was a financial risk. Investors began to rethink their allegiance. Hedge funds that once poured billions into Amazon shares quietly diversified. Banks questioned whether the company's trillion-dollar valuation was inflated, built more on myth than fundamentals. Analysts noted declining margins, rising legal liabilities, and slowing growth in Prime memberships. The whispers grew louder. Was Amazon still an unstoppable growth engine, or was it approaching the limits of its empire? For Wall Street, optimism gave way to caution. The political consequences were equally profound. Amazon's HQ2 debacle in New York remained a symbol of public resistance. Lawmakers emboldened by grassroots activism began drafting bills to regulate big tech more aggressively. In Brussels, European regulators imposed fines and threatened to break apart Amazon's business lines. In Washington, congressional hearings cast Bezos and his successors as symbols of unchecked corporate power. The Gaza empire that once manipulated politics through lobbying now found itself on the defensive. Culturally, Amazon's reputation fractured. The smiling arrow on cardboard boxes, once a symbol of convenience, began to feel sinister. Documentaries, exposés, and investigative reports painted the company as exploitative, manipulative, and invasive. Consumers questioned whether their convenience was worth the hidden costs. Alternative platforms gained traction, driven by promises of ethical sourcing, labor fairness, and privacy protection. The myth of Amazon as a benevolent innovator dissolved into suspicion. Even Bezos himself was not immune. His public image shifted from visionary entrepreneur to detached billionaire. Photographs of him aboard luxury yachts or unveiling a $500 million vessel requiring the dismantling of a historic bridge became lightning rods for criticism. His flight into space aboard Blue Origin, once intended as a celebration of innovation, was mocked as a billionaire's indulgence, a man leaving Earth while his workers collapsed on warehouse floors. The empire builder became the embodiment of excess. And yet, Amazon did not vanish. Empires rarely do. They linger, hollowed but powerful, surviving long after their myths collapse. Packages still arrived at doorsteps, Prime still renewed, AWS still powered the internet, but the foundation was weakened. The narrative of inevitability, the belief that Amazon was indestructible, was shattered. The aftermath of Amazon's rise and fall was not the end of e-commerce. It was a warning, a reminder that billion-dollar valuations and corporate empires can mask fragility. That unchecked power breeds collapse. and that when societies allow convenience to override accountability, they create the very monsters they later fear. For workers, the aftermath meant scars, physical, financial, and emotional. For small businesses, it meant markets lost and livelihoods erased. For governments, it meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that they had been complicit in empowering a monopoly. And for investors, it meant learning, once again, that growth stories, no matter how dazzling, always carry risk. The empire had not crumbled into dust, but it had been unmasked, and what lay beneath was darker than anyone had imagined. Every empire leaves wreckage behind, but in that wreckage are lessons, if we are willing to see them. Amazon's rise and reckoning is not just a story about Jeff Bezos or e-commerce. It is a case study in how modern power is built and how it corrodes. The first lesson is simple. No empire is too big to question. Enron was once hailed as the future of energy. Lehman Brothers was the bedrock of Wall Street finance. FTX promised to reinvent money itself. Each carried billion-dollar valuations. Each collapsed under the weight of arrogance and fraud. Amazon may still stand, but its shadow empire revealed the same fragility. Size and influence are not proof of permanence. They are warning signs of how devastating collapse can be when it comes. The second lesson: convenience has a hidden cost. Every package delivered in 24 hours was carried by workers racing against algorithms, by small businesses struggling to compete, by societies trading privacy for speed. Progress is rarely free. It is subsidized by someone else's sacrifice. The smiling arrow from A to Z masked a trail of exhaustion, exploitation, and control. The third lesson: unchecked power reshapes the rules. Amazon was not just a retailer. It was judge, competitor, and referee in its own marketplace. It was a logistics empire and a cloud monopoly, a political lobbyist, and a surveillance network. When one company controls so many levers, democracy itself bends around corporate power. The question is not whether Bezos built a great company. It is whether we allowed him to build something too great to be accountable. And the final takeaway: collapse is inevitable when growth becomes the only goal. History repeats it. Empires expand until the weight of their ambition crushes them. The signs are always there: labor unrest, public mistrust, political scrutiny. Amazon's story is not just about rise and fall. It is a mirror reflecting the illusions we buy into when we trade vigilance for comfort. The Dark Files exists to strip away those illusions, to remind us that behind every yacht, every skyscraper, every billion-dollar valuation lies the same truth. No empire lasts forever, and Amazon's shadow is proof. That was the story of Amazon, an empire built on cardboard boxes, cloud servers, and the unchecked ambition of Jeff Bezos. It is a reminder that wealth is never clean, that convenience is never free, and that the foundations of every empire are more fragile than they appear. But this autopsy is not the end. Because while Amazon perfected the art of control, another empire promised something even more seductive: freedom. The freedom of digital money, of a financial revolution accessible to anyone with Wi-Fi. It was called FTX, a crypto exchange valued in the tens of billions, endorsed by celebrities, trusted by Wall Street hedge funds, and hailed as the future of finance. And then, in a single breathtaking collapse, it vanished, taking billions with it. Subscribe to the Dark Files, because the next empire is already falling.